Ena mana ina rero ena kārangaranga maha tēnā koutou katoa, ko Waio, ko Nicholas Jones tukuinga, he uri tēnei mai tū hoi no Ngāpui. I'm standing in for Marama today as she is away giving a keynote conference that was planned prior to this invitation being sent out. But today I'll be speaking on two kaupapa we have been working on at the James Henare Research Centre. But before I begin that, I'd just like to pay special acknowledgement to Whaimiri Kepa, who has been pivotal in our thinking about this paper that we have written. So to get us underway. So our study takes an in-depth examination of the ethical concerns and the concept of hau and its applicability to Māori data sovereignty. Specifically, our study highlights concerns surrounding blood samples collected as part of the Lilacs in New Zealand study, a longitudinal study of elderly non-Māori and Māori living in advanced age, which I'll speak about more shortly. We explore several key issues relating to the concepts of privacy and data access that have become salient in the years since the study data and blood samples have been collected. We apply the concept of hau to chart a way forward for the data collected as part of the study. So here I have a few notes on how we've come to understand hau within the context of the study. For us, hau is a fundamental concept in Te Ao Māori and creates relationships through giving and receiving, emphasising connectivity and mutual reciprocity. It is a state of well-being and balance based on reciprocity and trust, formed through the act of giving and receiving, which underpins relationships between individuals and communities. The reciprocal act of exchanging hau, for example, during hongi, reaffirms and strengthens trust and commitment to one another. However, continual effort is required to maintain hau of relationships. If hau is not maintained, relationships may be alienated and put at risk. So to give some context around Lilacs New Zealand. Lilacs New Zealand is the first bicultural longitudinal study of advanced ageing in the world with an Indigenous cohort. The study aims to identify the predictors and supportive factors associated with health and well-being into advanced age and is situated at the School of Population Health at Waipapa Mataro, the University of Auckland. It began in 2010 and in total 421 Māori and 560 non-Māori participated in the study. Māori participants came from several iwi on the east coast, including Ngāti Awa, Te Whakatohea, Ngāi Tai, Tūwharitua ki Kawaro, Tūhoi, Te Whānau Apanui, and Te Arawa. The study involved a physical assessment, a detailed interview, an option to give blood samples, well, for the sake of our paper we deemed to be the gift, from these kaumātua and kuia, and an option to give researchers access to participants, general practitioners' records and hospitalisation data. The Lilacs New Zealand team was made up of investigators, a leadership group, allied university staff and also a group of kaumātua and kuia who made up the Rōpū Kaitiaki, including Whaimiri Kepa. The Rōpū Kaitiaki were experts in Mātauranga and Te Reo Māori and brought their expertise into the planning of the study design and translating documents from English to Te Reo. And for those participants who provided blood samples, these samples were taken to a laboratory. Subsequently, they were centrifuged to extract plasma, treated, and they have been stored in a freezer at the School of Population Health for now over 14 years. However, as time has passed, new issues, not surprisingly, have arisen about what to do with the study data. So what is the issue? Well, as you can see, there are many. Firstly, after being stored for such a long time, the quality of the plasma collected is now deteriorating. Investigators associated with the Lilacs study were advised that the samples collected would provide useful data up to 13 years in storage. Now, nearly 15 years on, the usefulness of these samples to researchers has already diminished. Of particular concern for our study, when Lilacs gained ethics approval, there was no requirement for or formal process put in place for the disposal or return of the collected blood samples or interview data to participants or their whānau. This has resulted in the Lilacs researchers now having to grapple with what to do with this data. While originally in a position to help inform this process, unfortunately as time has also gone on, the guidance of the large rōpū kaitiaki can no longer be sought as many of the members have now passed away, and with them their knowledge and input of tikanga. Likewise, the ability to reconnect with participants to inquire about their preferences of what happens to their data has also significantly diminished, as many of the kaumātua and kuia participants have also passed away. So when we asked the primary researcher affiliated with the project if there was a disposal process in place for the blood samples, he noted that there were no clear protocols in place to carry this out, apart from, quote, the culturally appropriate methods already in place for disposing bloods in public hospitals. So in light of these difficulties, the project researchers are somewhat stuck as to what next steps to take. And here I just wanted to illustrate some differences in understanding around the concept of toto between a biomedical and a Te Ao Māori perspective. In the course of our research, what became apparent there was a very big fundamental difference. From a Te Ao Māori perspective, toto is intimately entwined with your ora, your mauri, and importantly, your whakapapa. Similarly, wairua also resides within one's toto and forms the connection and interrelationship between all animate and inanimate things to the primordial ancestors of Papatūānuku and Ranginui and to each other. Like ora, mauri, and whakapapa, the wairua of toto also lives on after it is donated, including after the death of the person who donated it, and no matter the process that it goes through. It is for this reason that we argue the blood samples must be treated respectfully and protected from harm, and returned ultimately to the whānau after it has no longer been used for research. Another difference between Te Ao Māori and biomedical perspectives of blood is that from a Te Ao Māori view, toto is understood holistically. Rather than separating it into its different components such as plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells, etc. In Te Reo Māori, the word toto is a plural word and encompasses all these components and the information that is gleaned for them as one. This perspective differs from that of a biomedical perspective, wherein the blood samples are considered separate from the data. As a primary researcher for Lilacs stated to us, the samples are not data because they have not revealed their data yet. Rather, data from this biomedical perspective comes only from the analysis of the samples, not the samples themselves. So what do we argue? In light of such issues and cultural differences, our study emphasises that the concept of hou establishes an obligation for the Lilacs researchers to return what was gifted. In this case, the toto gifted by kaumātua and kuia, to participants or their whānau to decide to do with what next. To do so, we set down a challenge to researchers, highlighting that as they not only collected the data, but also benefited from its analysis, so too do they have the moral and ethical responsibility to re-engage with communities to establish pathways forward about what should happen next to their samples. Here we argue that as hou emphasises reciprocity and trust, so too does it dictate that the living individuals who gifted their toto or their surviving whānau are the ultimate decision makers about the samples and this data, a position that the Lilacs primary researcher also does acknowledge. However, I will note researchers must also be careful to mitigate the burdens that this may have on these individuals or their whānau. Finally, we point out that the end of a research project must be considered as equally important as the beginning. Re-engaging with communities requires a sizable investment of both time and financial resources. And thinking through the financing of a research project, researchers must be prepared to allocate time and funding for research end process at the beginning of a research project. This may include also allocating financial resources towards building community-held infrastructure to be able to store and maintain data collected as part of a study. So just to conclude this section, simply we maintain that Tahu establishes an obligation to return the gift given, in this case, for, and that this should be embedded far more thoroughly through in biomedical practices and in research practices more generally. That's part one. Now on to mine. So this is a kaupapa that I've been working on as part of my PhD. The title there was given by Dr. Robert Pofari, some of you may know. So I have to thank him for that. So we'll rip right into it. So my project is a multi-pronged in what it seeks to understand. First, it aims to identify Takatāpui, which here is basically queer Māori, for sake of this talk, stakes and interests in Māori data sovereignty, identify data risks Takatāpui deemed to be of paramount concern to the community, and explore notions of data privacy from Takatāpui perspectives. To begin to answer these questions, I conducted interviews with Takatāpui living in Tamaki Makaurau and Te Whanganui Ataru, and participants came from diverse EVM professional backgrounds. Also, a lot of them came from the East Coast. But I'm from there. So these included Takatāpui academics, leaders of Takatāpui organisations, artists, tertiary students, and those that have had a lifetime experience being amongst the Takatāpui community. Amongst those that I interviewed, good news, it was clear that there was a keen interest in the concept of Māori data sovereignty and how it may be applied to the Takatāpui community, and in particular, a want for better protection and the utilisation of Takatāpui data. So, before I get into the participants' insight, I just want to quickly outline some of the broader risks that are particularly applicable to the Takatāpui community. These are some of the main ones, not the biggest, but there's others, but these are the big ones. So first up is misclassification and visibility, where Takatāpui data has often been grouped under the broader Pākehā-dominated LGBTIQA+ category. This has resulted in the specific needs of Takatāpui often being missed. For example, in the 2023 census, the first census to collect data about people's sexual orientation and gender identity, the default categories given to select from were all in English. Some participants expressed dissatisfaction that Takatāpui is not an option to select from. Instead, a person identifying as Takatāpui would have to write this in when selecting, quote, the dreaded another identity category. With so many questions to answer as part of the census, not having Takatāpui to easily select from led some to simply select English identifiers out of ease. This has potentially led to misclassification and visibility in the data sets, and ergo, the data benefits not being attributed directly to Takatāpui. Another risk is the possibility of re-identification through data and potentially being outed, particularly for our transgender Takatāpui, as the smallness of this population means that it's far easier to connect transgender Takatāpui directly to their data. Within a global context, other issues are also emerging, which are very concerning. So first up, we have internationally, several governments have harnessed surveillance technology against queer peoples. In 2018, phone and computer surveillance technology was utilised by Azerbaijan police to find the sexual inclinations of citizens via Facebook, as Tahu indicated before. This resulted in 45 gay and bisexual men and transgender women being targeted by police, some of who were later arrested and tortured. Similar cases have also occurred in Indonesia and Egypt. Also in 2017, a US-based academic from Stanford, Tahu, used AI facial recognition software to develop, quote, a gaydar. Using over 35,000 images from a dating website, which I'll add he took without any ethics approval, this software was trained to predict sexual orientation based off facial characteristics. The technology was reliant on arbitrary factors that reflect bias and assumptions, such as that gay people are more likely to wear glasses and less likely to have facial hair. I'm probably not the greatest neighbour to count. The development of such technology is worrying as it has the potential to be used by anti-queer regimes in the future to monitor and classify people based on these arbitrary factors and potentially risk people's lives. And just to note too, we've also seen the offshoring of queer data in terms of dating platforms too, where people have been, you can opt to disclose your HIV status, but many of these dating apps, their servers are held internationally, so you're actually disclosing medical data overseas. So, good old saying, in light of such risks. Those I interviewed held some strong opinions regarding data ethics and how they envision data systems to work better for the Takatāpui community. First, participants can convey that, in their view, upholding Takatāpui data privacy was an ethical responsibility. I can't emphasise this enough, but it must be upheld by collectors and users of data to ensure the safety of Takatāpui. In line with the sentiment, many participants shared that Takatāpui data collectors and users must develop more comprehensive data systems and practices that take into consideration the disparities that currently exist. In particular, as some Takatāpui feel they are not recognised by the iwi hapu o whānau. Those that wish to collect and use such data must take into account that the sharing of raw data about Takatāpui with these communities may not always be suitable. Specifically, participants shared that they were extremely hesitant to share their medical data with these communities due to this data potentially outing them. However, this is not to say that all those that I interviewed were against sharing all forms of their data with these communities. Instead, participants conveyed that robust safety mechanisms must be in place to protect the privacy of Takatāpui in these data sets, including disaggregation of sensitive information, and when appropriate, for data collectors and users to actively seek permission from Takatāpui for the use of their data prior to the use of it. On this note, many participants shared that in their belief, if a person or entity wishes to collect or use Takatāpui data, they must include Takatāpui experts to oversee and inform how this data is collected, stored and administered. Finally, many interviewees also shared that they have not seen any tangible benefits derived out of their data yet. This they want to change. For these participants, Māori data sovereignty presents an avenue for this change. By taking account of Takatāpui data within Māori data sovereignty, we can not only help to bring light to the diverse makeup of Te Ao Māori, but we can also aid community decision makers to take action to better understand and mitigate the negative barriers that impact upon Takatāpui lives, such as establishing Takatāpui support services and raising broader social awareness about Takatāpui as important parts of our communities. Kia ora koutou.
Well, we just wanted to conclude our two rich sessions, a lot of whakaaro being shared, with a more informal chitty chat with three of our tangata who have been involved in this data privacy mahi, not inside the research team, apart from Whaia Mere, who's an overachiever. She's a researcher, kahui, kaumātua, and an external commentator. So we've got some pātai prepared in advance, because I think it's a bit rude to spring random pātai on people and expect them to just come up with answers on the spot. So we've just got a few pātai that we're going to have a kōrero about. I just want to introduce our guests, though, our guest panellists properly. And I'm going to start here with our Dr. Mere Kepa. I already talked a little bit about her in our morning session. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Mere as one of our kāhui kaumātua. She was involved in the Lilacs study from the early days and has been instrumental in the development of the research that Nick talked about, and Ho returning the gift. Whaiamere has a lot of whakaaro to share around privacy, as we've observed over the last 4 years in our wānanga, so we asked her to join this panel. To Whaiamere's right, we have Clare Ruru. So Clare is a privacy specialist. She started her professional career working in intelligence, regulatory investigation roles before falling into privacy and information sharing about a decade ago. So she has a special interest in children's privacy. We heard earlier that this is an area of quite significant concern for Māori. And has previously worked at the Office for the Chief Government Privacy Officer, the Ministry of Education, and is now a Principal Policy Advisor at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, but only looking specifically at the privacy of tamariki. So not about biometrics, so she's not here to talk about biometrics on behalf of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. Thought I'd better just say that. And then our final panellist is Jesse Porter. He's from Ngāti Porau, Ngāti Kauwhata, and works as a senior privacy advisor in central government. Much of his mahi involves the real-world application of privacy principles to contexts that are pretty complicated. They're sensitive, they're often urgent. So his work is very challenging but never dull, I think is what you said, Jesse. He's been actively engaging with Māori data sovereignty and governance for quite some years now and trying to figure out how to implement that in the context of central government mahi and in the absence of clear guidance. So I thought it would be good to bring these three panellists together for a little quick-fire kōrero and pātai before we go through to lunch, so nothing too formal. But I thought we'd start, so welcome, nau mai, thank you for coming. Now, I thought we'd start with just a pretty broad pātai, and maybe Whaiamere, if I may ask it of you first. Given your experiences, your expertise, all the rangahau and the activism that you've done over the years, what do you see as the key privacy issues facing us as Māori now?
Well, first of all, in the name of time and trying to get to the point in a very quick chat, I've written my answers.
We all have.
So, in response to Whanaunga's question here, my response is, in a diminished collective and democratic era, there are fewer harsher indictments against technology and trade that Māori people feel than exposure of our nature to biometrics.
Nice segue.
Nice segue. Biometrics. From my perspective, I think it's that shift into the global landscape and what that means for our data and how it's used. Other way of looking at it is total lack of control and how we get that back. We've got decisions being made about us, not by us, using data and analytics that we don't even know what's going on. So we don't have the opportunity to provide context to that data analytics or anything like that. So I think it is that global landscape, and that analytics can be done anywhere. It could be done in the Bahamas. You know, that's the global landscape that we're dealing with today. And also too, I think, just very quickly, the traditional inputs of analytics have changed. That used to be your name, your address, and how tall you were, and maybe your eye colour. And from that, people drew, you know, some inferences on what your preferences may be. So the bucket of inputs and data that's going into analytics today is really intrusive and invasive and using quite sensitive data in many cases. So I think it's how we get some of that control back in a global landscape is probably one of our biggest challenges from a privacy perspective.
So pretty similar to what Claire's said. Oh, yep, there we go. Pretty similar to what Claire's said there. What's really worried me over the years is just the sheer volume of personal information about Māori that's collected, collated, repackaged, repurposed, and shared around so many agencies. When we think of over-surveillance, we tend to think about CCTV, video technology, but our personal information is a big commodity at the moment, and for the most part, it's not Māori that's benefiting from our own personal information. And particularly when you think it can be retained for years, even decades, it can be used for all sorts of purposes, and that time, as I say, it can be shared about agencies without any of us even knowing that our information is going out there and going around. And then the other part for me, and sort of dovetails into that, is that I think the Privacy Act is far too permissive about the collection, the use and sharing of personal information for statistical and research purposes, particularly when you factor in there that there's no requirement to notify or consult with the people whose information is being used. And I think a lot of people would actually be genuinely surprised how much of their personal information is just out there doing the rounds and how many people have access to it, particularly when you count them up across those different agencies. And so in my personal opinion, especially with the advance of technology, with the data processing capacities, with the increased sophistication of things like AI and algorithms, it just shouldn't be so easy to collate so much of our personal information, strip it of its Māori, strip it of its context, but use it to make predictions and decisions about us as a collective. Kia ora.
I was talking to someone in the audience about FPIC, free, prior and informed consent, because consent is not the backbone of the Privacy Act. It's actually invisible. It's sort of implicit. It's an exception. Consent is an exception, and we don't think like that. We've been talking a lot about consent, not only consent for the primary purpose, when the toto's collected, but for the secondary and third and fourth uses, because it gets used and reused again with no consent. So if the Privacy Act, as the main form of regulation, treats consent as an exception, is consent dead?
It speaks to authorisation too. So we have a disconnect in terminology straight off the bat. And I think that, and I'm not sticking up for the Privacy Act here, but it initially created that balance, right, between permissive collection, use and disclosure of data and protecting it where it needed to be protected. We're in a very different space now in terms of what needs to be protected and how we look at that. So, that individualism, collective sort of approach to privacy, the Act hasn't morphed and moved with that. And I think, from a consent point of view or authorisation from a legal perspective is one person authorising one person to do something else. So even the framework's not made to be able to consent once, consent twice, and ongoing consent through the life cycle of our data through whatever journey it's going. Well, you think about how you give consent in practice.
Yeah.
You sign a form and there's a little tiny bit of writing down the bottom that says you consent for us to give all this information you've provided above to government agencies for the purposes of making decisions about you. We just sign because we want access to the doctor, or we want to submit an ACC claim form, or we want to get our prescription from the pharmacy. So it comes back to that data for access to service, data for access to product, it's become a commodity or a lever to get access to a service.
Creative ways that our whānau and rōpū, without a lot of resource, I might add, Ngāti Tipa is not a post-settlement entity. There's no entity, there's no pūtea. It's really just trying to be creative with what you have. What are some of the useful strategies that we might use to better protect the information that's precious to us, given all the stuff that you've talked about with the lack of consent and the loopholes in protection? What are some of the things that we can do ourselves? Does anyone have any whakaaro on that?
Yep, I'll just collapse my 2 set answers to the next 2 questions and tell you this. For me, it's the nature of the collective that is important, and the nature of the collective that is important to me are the principles of mana, whanaungatanga and kaitiaki. Don't follow those, don't talk about them with regard to consent at all. That's what is important to me. The nature, the shape, the form, the philosophy of the collective. I didn't hear you guys talking about the collective. Your turn.
I love these
Segue.
Building on that, I think one of the things we can do is take back a little bit of control of what we do with our data, either as an individual or our hapu iwi data, is think before we tap, think before we submit, think before we post. It does give us like if we take social media, for example, it does give us access to socialise with whānau and friends overseas, those sorts of things. There's a lot of positive benefits that can be drawn from social media. But think about what you are putting into that environment. If it, is it information and data that's precious to you? Don't put it there. You can convey excitement over an event without putting up 164 photos that show where you live, the inside of your marae, how many mokopuna you have, etc., etc. So I think we've kind of got swept up in a more information is better in a global kind of online environment, and I think maybe we could go back to less is more, and let's put what's precious to us in places where we have full control and understanding of what's happening with it.
Kia ora. Yeah, similar to what Claire said, just being mindful about what information we put out there in the first place, because it all sort of adds up over time. And a lot of it's information about other people as well. So overseas DNA companies are a really ready example. I do wonder, they must have a huge amount of whakapapa and genealogical information about the Māori population as a whole by now. So it's sort of being careful what we put out there and also being informed about what's out there. So the Privacy Act, for all its limitations, if agencies hold our personal information, they're accountable to us and they're answerable to us about that. So get in touch with them, ask them what personal information about you they hold, ask them why they hold it, what they're doing with it, how long they plan to keep it, how they're keeping it secure, how many people have access to it, who it's being shared with, things like that, knowing kind of what our information is out there, what it's doing. And talk to whānau as well, especially those who may be less tech savvy or just more vulnerable to being exploited for their data and information. Kia ora.
And I can just add one thing to that as well. I think we've got some really good, like we've got the Māori Data Governance Framework, we've got the Privacy Framework and the Māori Privacy Framework. Let's use them. Let's not have them as a piece of a product that's at the end of a 4-year research project that gets referenced in another academic paper. Let's use them. Let's test when we're working with government agencies. Let's ask them how they've embedded the data governance framework model into their operations. Challenge some of the ways that they're collecting behaviour using those frameworks. When you're working with your own whānau or hapu around data, bring that Māori data privacy framework into how you manage your own whānau data on a day-to-day basis. And I think the more we talk about it, the more we set the expectation that this is how we expect our data to be collected, used and shared, the louder our voices get, the stronger they get, in a constructive way, of course. The people we're engaging with are going to have to sort of be able to give us answers back and hopefully lead to change of behaviour in the agencies that we engage with. Come on this journey with us. It's a great journey to be on. It just requires a behaviour change in how we look at data.
I mean, I think like if it's anything, like with our reo, with our whenua, with kura, the impetus has always come from Māori communities. For anything that requires transformation or change, it doesn't come from the kāwanatanga. But I guess our next question would be, we all have to go. This might be a bit, I think this will be okay. Claire, probably you might want to sit this one out, given that you're at OPC. But we all have to go to the supermarket to get our kai. A supermarket in some form. I have to go to the Ngārua Wāhi in New World. It's like the friendliest supermarket in the motu. We don't have FRT there, but it could be coming there soon. So Foodstuffs had a facial recognition technology trial. The Office of the Privacy Commissioner, I think, has done an assessment on that. I haven't seen the report yet. But a lot of the everyday conversations that I have with whānau, they don't want to be surveilled while they're buying their kai. And in our submission to the biometrics code, we said uncategorically surveillance technology should be banned in public spaces, full stop. And that included supermarkets. And it was just very clear. Of course, that won't happen. It will be allowed. So I guess the question is, what are your thoughts, we'll start with Whaemere, on facial recognition technologies and other types of surveillance technologies being used in public spaces? And how do you feel about your mokopuna living in a world where they might be constantly watched?
Firstly, I'd just like to thank Clare. When I go home, I know my first job will be to write a pānui. I do write pānuis, but I've been struggling for a topic, and I certainly will be going back to write about the Privacy Act in a way that I know my cousins and my relations at home in the kāinga where I live will understand. So, yeah, I'm out there. In reply to your question, Tahu, again, I've prepared it, and the foco of my thought is the threat to individual and collective intimacy, because I think this is what they're touching, our nature, our intimacy, as well as the individual and collective preference for a future that isn't premised on the idea of a Māori as a criminal, a shoplifter, an alcoholic, a drug addict, a cripple, and a cost to the Crown partner, as a Crown partner. So that's my beginning, and I hand it over to you once again.
I think one comment I will make is, if you are, as a government agency, looking to put forward a policy proposal that results in this type of surveillance of people in public spaces, you need to be able to justify the benefits to society of that proposal. And I think from a policy perspective more broadly, we're missing some of that. You know, we're missing the evidence to support the policy proposals that may or may not indicate that in this case, higher surveillance outweighs the collective interests that we've been talking about. I'm not saying in this case it does, but just that type of analysis. We are missing that. We shouldn't have to get to submission stage to be able to input our views and our context into a policy proposal that's just about at code stage or just about at ledge stage, you know, that sort of thing. So I'm talking more generally, you know, and what could we possibly do to be able to provide that context to the government agencies at an earlier part of the policy development stage. So we're not sitting here as we are today in relation to the code. I'll perhaps leave the code just at that.
A bit outside of my professional expertise, I think my thoughts probably tend to reflect the general unease that people have. You know, who's doing the recordings, where are they storing it, how long are they storing it for, what are they using it for, who has access, those sorts of things. And we know that the accuracy of things like facial recognition technology are much lower if you're not male and pale. So the harms for those outside of that, of anything from embarrassment to false accusations for crimes, those risks are also higher for our communities. At the end of the day, though, I've got to say our rangatahi are sharp, and like for better or worse, this is the world that they're growing up in. Not just CCTV, but like the constant pressure for a constant online social media presence and things like that, and I think they're going to have the best answers at the end of the day.
I hope they got better answers, eh? Yeah, we're hoping on that. Sometimes we get, I think, you know, like the protection, the lock away, the protect instinct is really quite strong. But of course, privacy can't just be about locking everything up. There's got to be a balance there. So if we can end on a positive note before we go into lunch, people are looking hungry. Whaemere, what do you see as some of the opportunities then in this space to do like data privacy in a tika way?
You see, my prepared answers are, folks, more conferences such as this one. Yep. And they should be organised by Māori and international Indigenous scholars, artists and technocrats, individually and collectively, of course. Now, Māori, we should remain determined to pass on our best legacy to the younger generations. It is important to remember that ideas, like things, wither away, but ideas and things grow again and again and again and again. Human rights laws should be reviewed again and again and again in the years and decades and centuries ahead. And finally, individually and collectively, Māori should never forget that the more the mechanical the age, the less humane the time of life will become.
Kei a koe, Jesse,
Kia ora.
kōrero whakamutunga.
Yeah, so I mean, privacy is as much about enabling access to our information as it is protecting it from misuse of harm. And so, again, just an example with those DNA companies, if we could get back all of that information about Māori from all of those companies, potentially how many Māori who have been lost and separated from their whakapapa, could we re-find, could we reconnect? And so there's a lot of risks in all of these agencies holding so much of our data, but there is tremendous value in that information for Māori if we can find a way to repatriate it and to bring it back. And somewhat to Clare's point there, so what the Privacy Act does lack is essentially space for us to decide what's important to Māori, but that is a collective decision, and at the moment we are very few and far between in data privacy, data governance, information management, information policy and things like that. So we can identify gaps, we can make general suggestions, but when it's like high-level strategy decisions like what's important to Māori, that's not something we can really answer in relative isolation. And so there's opportunity for us there as a collective or just as a critical mass in those spaces, because frameworks are great, but I do believe that we are most effective by simply being there in the spaces where decisions about our data and information are being made. Kia ora.
I'm going to interpret that as hashtag give it back. Well, that concludes our privacy, data and governance part of the Tikanga and Technology program.